I'll just give it a few minutes, Michelle, a few seconds, sorry, about 30 seconds before you start.
I'll bring us all together with an opening karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, ki mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhunga, ti he mori ora.
Tēnā tātou, ko se McCabe toku ingoa, I whānau mai au I te omaru, I te rohi o nai tāhu. Kei te whanganui a Tara ahau I noho ana ki raro I te mana o te Aotearoa. I mahi ana au ki te toputanga.
You're doing it that much. Oh, no, I'm going to go in.
O Aotearoa, ara Philanthropy New Zealand. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Just to check that everyone is on mute. Hello everybody and welcome to today's session for funders on the findings from Sector Hauora Survey 2021. Hot off the press, we will be hearing about how the community and voluntary sector is going given the ongoing COVID-19 environment and other factors that are providing challenges and opportunities for our community organisations. Ngā mihi kia koe Michelle mō te karakia timatanga. First, I'd like to thank Hui Community Aotearoa and Volunteering New Zealand for producing this really important research. It's the second survey, which makes the insight all the more meaningful. Philanthropy New Zealand was involved as a partner in the first one, and I'd like to acknowledge the Centre for Social Impact within Foundation North, who led the survey design and analysis in the first survey last year. We've not been involved this year, aside from being very keen cheerleaders. So what is presented today, the survey findings and the recommendations will be new to me, and I can't wait to hear them. This research is incredibly important because the voice of the sector needs amplifying at both community, government and political levels if Aotearoa is to thrive. The work of the community and voluntary sector is so critical in our social, environmental and economic well-being. Data about the sector is a building block for it to have more influence in decisions that affect it and where the decision makers rely on the community sector to implement and create the change. So thank you to the funders who are attending today and for your support for the community sector. You do receive a lot of data from the organisations you fund and from elsewhere, but this intelligence provides additional powerful information to support your decision making. I'll now introduce the presenters today. Michelle Kitney is the Kaiahotu Chief Executive of Volunteering New Zealand, where she's been part of the senior leadership team since 2018. Michelle works collaboratively and with impact in the for-purpose sector. She's volunteered extensively in community organisations that provide services and support to whānau and children. Rochelle Stewart-Allen is Po Kaiarahi General Manager with Hui Community Aotearoa. She's a senior leader with over 10 years executive management and leadership experience in the community, government, NGO and corporate environments. Over the course of her career, Rochelle has demonstrated a passion for philanthropy while playing a pivotal role in building, supporting and driving community initiatives as a member of various government, public and private organisations. Also speaking today is Dr. Solmaz Nazari Orakani, the part-time research manager for Volunteering New Zealand. She's also a postdoctoral fellow at Massey University and undertakes research for the University of Otago. Solmaz is passionate about achieving better outcomes for various social groups, the role of volunteering and volunteers in improving the well-being of communities, and developing empowering social policies that facilitate this process. Solmaz will now present the research findings, and Rochelle and Michelle will present the recommendations with some commentary around them before we'll move into a discussion and Q&A. I'd just like to acknowledge Hui and Volunteering New Zealand. They are fabulous community sector peak bodies and PNZ partners with them and really enjoys working with them as we have many shared objectives. So I'm just grateful today to be part of this really important webinar. Just a few nuts and bolts before I hand over to Dr. Solmaz, and that is please put your questions in the chat, and also, or you can message me directly if you prefer that. I think that's all the housekeeping. I'm sure Michelle or Rochelle will let me know if not. Over to you, Solmaz.
Thank you, Sue. Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to the Hauora Wellbeing Survey release. And I will present the survey findings to you during the next 15 to 20 minutes. And just a bit of background about our research. In 2020, Hauora Community Aotearoa and Voluntary New Zealand partnered with the Centre for Social Impact and Philanthropy New Zealand to survey the impact of COVID-19 on the tangata whenua, community and voluntary sector. As the pandemic continued to impact the sector, in 2021, Hauora Community Aotearoa and Voluntary New Zealand were commissioned by the IA to study the well-being of the sector and how it has been affected by the pandemic. Before presenting the findings, I would like to thank and acknowledge representatives from tangata whenua, community and voluntary organizations who shared their mahi with us. And also this research was contracted out to McCabe Research Aotearoa. And I want to acknowledge and thank them for the work they have done. And also, I would like to acknowledge the Department of Internal Affairs for commissioning and funding for this research. This research is focused on tangata whenua, community and voluntary sector. Data were collected between June and July 2021 through different approaches, including an online survey, multiple focus groups, key informant interviews, and Pacifica Phono. The research team tried to capture the voices of the communities, those communities that are less heard, for example, Maori, Pacifico, ethnic, and disability community organization. As you can see, and the figure shows the geographical distribution of the total 606 organizations that participated in this survey. And when we asked about the ethnic groups their organization mainly work with, the majority of the respondents said they work with the population of 2 or more ethnic groups. We can see in the figure that 80% of our respondents work with the New Zealand, European, Pakeha, and Iwi, followed by 76.1% of organizations working with Maori. Next slide, please. And I'm going to present the findings in 4 themes, and about the impact and well-being of the funding, impact on well-being, funding, service delivery, and volunteers. And I'm going to explain each theme, its impact, and possible solution to relieve the pressure. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is well-being. Since the beginning of COVID-19, the well-being of paid workers and volunteers of our respondents' population has been challenged in multiple ways. Their well-being was affected by several factors, including stress, anxiety, fatigue, and workload, and funding and service pressure. We heard many stories of people experience high level of stress resulting from pandemic. However, they remain optimistic, try to maintain a positive attitude, and receive greater appreciation for their work. The staff and volunteers were stressed out, low salaries, uncertainty, and fear around COVID and working with vulnerable communities contributed to their low well-being. The workload of staff and volunteers increased. Some people experience stress and they struggle to balance self-care with community care. The CEs and managers were under pressure as they had to deliver more with less, and the support their staff, and there were not the same money mentoring and support mechanism offered for organization CEs. In addition, competitive, complex, inflexible funding models were cited as one of the biggest pressures on organizations. Now let's see the possible solutions to improve the well-being of the sector. All of these solutions were suggested by our participants. Our sector needs more collaborative partnership, and these partnerships should be supported. Competitive funding models create issues, and the sector wants these removed, and the funding becomes more equitable. Our respondents suggested there should be a better access to counseling services and support for staff, including chief executives. And this importance of network and relationship building was another suggestion by our respondents to improve the sector's well-being. The next theme that I'm going to talk about is funding. Our respondents reported that the funding was an issue for the community organization. They said there was a lack of transparency over how funding is distributed in the sector. Funding and grant opportunities are often hard to find, very competitive, and difficult to apply for. The application process is complex and lengthy. The funding is often short-term, which makes long-term and strategic planning very difficult. The funding usually does not cover staff salaries and a range of other expenses. Frequent changes to eligibility criteria was also mentioned by our participants. When we ask community organization, next slide, please. When we ask a community organization about their funding, 38.3% of respondents reported no change in annual funding or revenue. 23.1% reported an increase, and 36.8% reported a serious decline in funding revenue. As you can see in this slide, the figure shows that the pandemic impact on the funding and volunteer organization as well. As you can see, 48.5% reported no change in annual funding or revenue, 12.1% reported an increase, and 39.4% reported a serious decline in funding revenue for volunteering organization. And let's see the solution as suggested by our participants. Our respondents suggested several solutions to relieve the funding process on the sector. Many respondents want competitive funding models to be removed. They also ask for multi-year funding so they can invest in people and their professionals development. Funding can also cover salaries and operational costs and expenses, and our respondents like to see increased trust and knowledge sharing in the funding area. So far, we covered well-being and funding, and now we move to the third theme, which is the pandemic impact on service delivery. As you can see in the figure, 84% of the respondents have maintained or increased their level of services. This was 38.7 in 2020, and 26% of respondents have make cuts compared to 61.3 in 2020. So service delivery seems to be in a better position than in 2020. In terms of change to their operations, 41.3% of respondents said that they were delivering more online and phone services. 39.2% said they have been seeing new funding sources, and 20.2% said they had made no changes operationally. Next slide, please. Okay. Sorry. The funding and the COVID pandemic has continued to impact the sector's financial viability. As you can see in the diagram, 53.3% of respondents said they have enough funds to operate for more than 12 months. This was 29.8% in 2020. 23.9% of the respondents had enough funds for 6 to 12 months, compared to 26.6% in 2020. And finally, 22.7% of respondents had enough funds for less than 6 months, compared to 43.5% in 2020. So again, it seems that more organizations feel confident about their financial position in 2021 compared to 2020. And the last theme that I'm going to talk about is the impact on volunteers. Volunteers remain extremely resilient despite increased workload and shift to online delivery. During pandemic, volunteers maintain loyalty to the organization and communities they serve. Some organizations reported they had fewer volunteers and their older volunteers needed support with the online technology. Some organizations reported an increase in the number of younger volunteers, and migrant volunteers with families overseas in high-risk areas reported additional stress. And here, the overview of the findings that I just covered, and the slide shows an overview of the findings. The survey revealed that our sector has been working hard despite continuous pressure on budget, staffing, service delivery, and personal well-being. We also saw the importance of the network for well-being and service provision. And finally, the survey indicated an abundance of energy, skills, love, and respect in the sector. Our survey also revealed the impact, revealed that pandemic resulted in some positive outcomes for the sector. 51.3% of respondents said they have seen greater appreciation for and recognition of their work. 51% said the pandemic has resulted in greater collaboration in the sector, and 50% said their organization has become more flexible. And as you can see in the next slide, the quotations, they are the quotations that the stories that we heard from many participants about how the pandemic has created an opportunity to consider the organization's strategic direction, vision, and values. Some respondents also talk about the opportunity for vulnerable groups to push for required changes. The survey also provides some insight into the lesson learned from the pandemic and what the sector thinks about its future. Pandemic has also shown some areas for change, strengthening, and improvement in the sector, as you can see in the quotation here. And in this slide, as the figure shows, 63.7% of respondents thought more collaboration between organizations is required to strengthen the sector. This was 62.9 in the 2020 survey, which is very similar. And furthermore, funding for salaries and operational costs was the second most important change in 62.4%. This was also 60.5 in 2020 survey. And the last bit of the presentation, I will talk about the strategies for strengthening the sector. These strategies have been identified by and suggested by our participants. They thought the sector needs to create more opportunities for collaboration between organizations. System inequities should be addressed. Some participants wanted the sector to use the pandemic to reset and as an opportunity to create a more connected community where we can more responsibility for ourselves and others. Many representatives from the sector thought that the sector can be strengthened with more diverse leadership. They also want funding processes to be improved and simplified with multiple languages available. And a strong sector would also require understanding the lived experience of service users and increased availability of counseling services. Thank you for listening. And I'm going to hand it over to Michelle and Rochelle for the discussion and recommendation and implications. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Solmaz. It's been really fantastic to have her mahi on board with us to help us through this immense body of research that we've got. This year, as she mentioned, Solmaz, that we wanted to try to capture some of the voices that weren't captured last year, particularly around Māori, Pacific, ethnic and disability communities, because we know that some of them may not actively participate in the online survey. So we had focus groups and key informant interviews to really wrap around and provide more support in that space. So it's a huge body of work. I think it's 93 pages is the full report, and I've mentioned already in the chat that we'll be sending that out to you today. There's also a summary report, which is not quite as long. But there's so much richness in there. People were really open and honest. The thing primarily that stood out for me, which is that the service delivery has gone up and the funding's gone down. Either stayed the same or gone down, and that is bringing a lot of challenges, particularly for the small and medium community groups and charities. There's a lot of tiredness in the sector, and you would have seen Solmaz talking about wellbeing. That came out a lot. We talked particularly about chief executives working without that kind of ongoing support that, say, might be evident for business SMEs that might have the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Mentor Program and business advisors. Chief executives in the community and voluntary sector and tangata whenua sector don't have that kind of level of support. So there's actually a need for that. There's definitely a lot of need for the balance between self-care and community care. So we saw a lot of people referring to that about being tired, burnt out, bad behaviours, leaving jobs, etc. So there's a lot of really tired people, and I think that's really indicative of the whole country, to be honest. but I think when you are helping the helpers, so essentially when these community groups are working at the front line, they're also needing support and priority for their wellbeing and resourcing for that as well. Michelle, would you like to start to talk a little bit more specifically about the voluntary sector?
Kia ora, Rochelle, thank you. And if anyone's noticed, I had to change rooms, so I no longer have a banner behind me. That's the reality of working in the not-for-profit sector, moving rooms mid-meeting. So a couple of things that surfaced to the top for me in relation, specifically in relation to the volunteering sector. Everything that Rochelle's already captured obviously really resonates as well in terms of increased service delivery being a key thing for us to keep at the front of our mind. I guess when we look at voluntary organisations, so typically your associations, more organisations that are more volunteer run than some of the others in the cohort we're looking at, they do have less money than average. But they've also, when you dig down into some of the stats, they actually have, in the smaller end of the sector, they've got a little bit less people and staff as well. So there's some challenges, particularly for our smaller organisations, and potentially in some spaces, bigger organisations are doing it better. And when you look at certain factors, I think last year we heard about or had concerns in relation to, I guess, ongoing sustainability of organisations, and obviously the data shows that shifted somewhat. But I think what has, I guess, surfaced this year is workforce wellbeing, and I think I'd just love to highlight that when we're talking about the workforce in the sector, 115,000 not-for-profits, the 90% of them are volunteer run. So our workforce within the sector is a huge chunk of them are made up of volunteers, or people giving their time and their effort and their mahi, and that has totally woven into the, I guess, the fabric of these organisations. So when we think about solutions in relation to wellbeing in particular, that we think about those being for both paid and unpaid staff. Is a key thing I would like to highlight, and I think because that sort of sits alongside what's often not visible or not funded is the infrastructure or the operational costs for you working through a volunteer workforce. So just highlighting that. I think another key thing that sort of has surfaced for me is thinking about those changes in volunteer demographics that have come through as a response to the situation over the last 18 months to 2 years, where we have seen in this survey and anecdotally and wider that there are more younger volunteers coming into the sector, which is awesome. But what does our engagement with them look like going forward? And I think this, innovation into the future, we need, strategies for embracing how we engage with new and different cohorts of people who want to get on board with our mission and kaupapa. And I think co-design is a great place to start for that. And that will probably help with us addressing opportunities around new and emergent leadership coming through the sector. And I think also that co-designing what we deliver in terms of volunteers and volunteering and with service users themselves, or with the communities we are working with, what are the having them inputting into what we design coming out of it.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, absolutely agree with you that, bringing volunteers on is one way to help deliver the mahi. And as we talked earlier, all community organisations by majority are using volunteers, whether they're a paid organisation, a registered charity or incorporated society, or whether they are a fully voluntary organisation. So volunteers are really the key here. What I wanted to talk a little bit was about some of the specifics that we saw in the groups that we looked at. So we saw with Māori community organisations, they talked a lot about whakawhanaungatanga and that those kin relationships that they already had in place, that ultimately that was their solution to provide for the communities in need, was reaching out to the networks that they already had. Both within the whānau networks, but then also in the non-kin networks as well. So people locally based, that they found much more success in doing that than necessarily getting government or philanthropic support, that they found that was the solution that they needed. An example they were using was the Generator program, which MSD funds to get local based community champions who are well connected and well networked in a particular place. That they talked about that and as a good example of something that worked really well during COVID, but also they said that there was a lot of complexity and that they had to effectively translate the sort of official documentation around that for people at a local level to understand. What we saw with the Pacifica communities is that they were saying that they were finding it very tough. Also, same with the Māori communities, very tough because they are very people orientated. They were finding it particularly tough at the times when they were not able to meet with the church community or their local community. They were asking specifically for Pacific language resources. So they were saying the people that were the kind of interim people and helping them with funding applications and getting registered as charities so they could apply for funding. They were saying that effectively that there's got to be a person who's translating that information from those resources for the local communities to be able to even apply for funding. And the words that really stuck out for me was the quote was simplify, simplify, simplify. That they were saying there was just way too much complexity for people to be understanding that even if they found the funding application to be able to then actually complete it themselves, and that organisations need a lot of wraparound support to help them even to be in a position to apply for funding. We saw with the ethnic and refugee background communities, a lot of them were finding it tough because they already had family and whānau overseas in some quite precarious positions, some COVID hotspots, some, as you know, in war zones or at-risk communities, and they were finding it very tough to work in the community supporting their own local communities while also managing the personal challenges that took to be doing that. They also asked for simplicity and translation of applications and much more simplified processes. Some of the Pacifica communities were saying, could we not just apply with a video? Like, do we have to do these really sort of long, complex application forms that we find really tough to do? Could we not just provide a video? Another comment that came back, which was saying from the community organisations, was saying, surely the responsibility is on the funders to understand why and do their due diligence about a community organisation, rather than the community organisation has to do all the work to put forward their case to be getting funding. And this is one of the things that came in that comment around trying to reduce down the competitive funding models. So a good example is Match, which, as you know, Philanthropy New Zealand's launching next year in March, which is where organisations, particularly this will be useful for the smaller ones, to be able to put up their profile and ask for what they wanted, and then effectively the funders work in the back end to work out how to fund that. An example is, say they wanted $50,000, they could say, one organisation could say, hey, we can give them 20, and then they could contact other like-minded funders that they were aware of that would support that kaupapa and then make up the 50K. So these kind of things are really useful, and it's great to see them on the horizon. I think just the other thing I wanted to clarify, which is what we saw last year, which is that the issues separate into some of the direct impacts of COVID and the increased pressure on community organisations, but a lot of it, as you'll recognise, is long-term systemic issues that have been in place for a long time, and a frustration that sort of is not shifting very quickly. But having said that, we really acknowledge those funders that are working both inside government and philanthropy to really try to make processes much easier. Good example is Wellington Community Trust, who's completely simplified down their funding application forms, really aware and reaching out to new communities. There was a lot of requests, particularly in those Māori, Pacific, ethnic and disability communities, to say, hey, we need more help to be able to access funding. So Rochelle, over to you.
Thanks, Rochelle. At some point, so are you getting any questions coming in? I've got a few more comments I can make, but
you make your comments. There's been a couple of questions come in, but keep going. Thank you.
Kia ora, Stu, thank you. So I just wanted to kind of touch on a little bit more around, I guess, funding and how some of the things that have come out of the survey, in my mind, sort of land. And I think thinking about, I guess, whakawhanaungatanga, collaboration, building new and different futures, I think they actually, those are things that need to be, resourced differently, or actually resourced in the first place. They're actually typically not something we see being resourced through our current funding models, which is, to a large extent understandable, but to build relationships sustainable into the future actually takes a shift in focus and in time. And I think I would just also focus on the fact that if there are shifts towards funding things around people or staff, that we also include that volunteers, which I kind of touched on before as well. And I think there's a sort of question that came up in the last session, which I think when I think about I won't go on about that, but basically, if we're sort of moving away from a place of, or a competitive funding models, we want to, the ideal could be to moving towards a greater focus on kaupapa and connectedness and capacity building and outcomes, rather than widgets and bums on seats. And I think, that often the answer isn't just more volunteers. That is not, it isn't just more people. It's about strategically kind of setting ourselves up to achieve a more connected future. And, and I actually think that that is what unites people. That is the thing that is the same across organisation as the kaupapa. We're often working towards similar objectives. So that's a place where we can start that forward moving conversation, I think. I think also we've seen lots of innovation and new things and amazingness come out of the last year and a half. Often this is not funded within our current operational funding quite often, and I wonder what is continuing to allow and build that innovation look like from a funding point of view. So yeah, that's probably enough.
Thanks, Rochelle. Yeah, there was absolutely a lot of conversation and a lot of comments around collaboration, that the sector had been automatically collaborating both locally, nationally, regionally and nationally, that they wanted to continue to do that, but it needed resourcing to do that, that it doesn't necessarily fit the current funding models around project funding that's tagged to specific delivery of projects, that collaboration takes a long time. There were examples where collaboration had launched last year in the first lockdown last year, but then it kind of tipped over because it simply wasn't resourced enough to be able to continue on. So there was definitely a lot of comment about collaboration, and I felt really encouraged because a lot of comment that the sector itself is both at a local and regional level is a kind of self-organizing ecosystem. So essentially it's just doing its mahi, it's making it happen. It knows where the expertise is, where the needs are, it's connecting everybody together and making that happen. So therefore it's really about complementing that, funding complementing that. Funding is not the only solution, and I think we've always talked about this particularly at Hauora, is funding is one part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. So there's other things like in-kind support. There was a lot of discussion about more trusted relationships, that there was a direct quote saying one of the government agencies used to just say to community organisations, you have the expertise and you know what's needed and you have the leadership to make it happen, so we'll fund you to do that, versus having greater control and more set criteria that can be more difficult for community organisations to match to actually get the resourcing they're needing to deliver their services frontline. I think particularly there was interest around more flexible funding as well. We saw that happening, that organisations had really sort of shifted and changed their service delivery as necessary. I think we already saw that the service delivery had, as well as increased, had gone much more online, but a lot of people were still delivering both online and in person, had gone back to that now that some of the lockdowns had happened. Just a reminder that we recorded this, we did the research just before the latest lockdowns, so it's kind of a good snapshot before we went into full lockdown. Also, there was a lot of comment in there. You would have seen in Solmaz's results when she was talking about over 60% of people were asking for salary and operational costs. So this is certainly something that we continue to promote. For those who've read the JB Ware report, where they did the analysis of the data set for the charities register, that showed that on average it's about 40% as a charity is spending on their operational costs. So that's salaries and operational costs. So really recommend, if you're looking to fund someone, that you allow them to charge that part. I know some of you allow operational costs, but really salaries are the backbone of our sector. So we deliver so much mahi, incredible, valuable mahi, and the majority of it goes on to salaries. So that's really where the shift is needed. So if you're giving someone $100, allow them to charge $40 of that for salaries and operational costs, because really what they're needing is that back office infrastructure. And that is what's really enabled the whole sector and all our community organisations to survive through this pandemic period, because they've been able to have the salaries and be able to change and shift and adapt and adjust and shift people where needed. Whereas if they had specific project funding, that couldn't necessarily be put forward. So Michelle, have you got more thoughts?
I was just getting excited by the comments in the chat about one of the organisations is actually focusing on building capacity to measure outcomes as one of its things it's doing alongside funding, so to speak on behalf of the comment maker, and that's enabling organisations to tell their story and access other funds. And I think actually that also, you know, it's a beautiful circle, because it's also about the story that you tell your non-funding supporters as well, and about the difference that you make. And I think often there isn't a lot of time, money, capacity to focus on those things, especially if you're moving year to year, rather than looking 3 to 5 to 10 years down the track. Yeah, so that's exciting.
So you've got a couple of questions coming through.
Yes, thank you, Solmaz, Rochelle and Michelle for that. Some questions have come through. The first one, and I'll read it verbatim. I'm interested to know more about the solution to competitive funding models. I get it and support the gist. My concern is that we potentially move to a contracting model, which would result in far fewer organisations being funded. Or another model could be funders putting dollars to initiatives they deem to fit their criteria, but this raises questions around equity and transparency, as the process could be quite behind closed doors and not universally open to all. So keen to know what the sector would like to see if competitive funding models were removed. Thank you. So it is a hard question, but interested in your thoughts, Rochelle and Michelle, about what is a good alternative to this competitive funding model? I
mean, we were discussing that earlier, right? Because it's a sort of very big request from the sector, and there's no one solution. I think that's the bottom line. An example we were using was Todd Foundation, that doesn't have a application process. They do their due diligence and then they go out and approach organisations who they believe line up with their kaupapa, and then have the kōrero, and then get to a point where they agree on funding, and then there's not an accountability report. Instead, they bring everybody together to work collectively together and share. So that's just one example. I think Match will be another example that'll start to do it. I think the reality is that the load on the community organisations to be hearing about funding, B, applying for funding, and C, waiting to hear about funding is so huge that there has to be better ways of working. So there's no panacea to fix all these problems. These are very long, entrenched processes. And so we just really encourage you to speak with other funders, examples of organisations who are starting to work in different ways. We also see this in government as well. There's some reviews around one of the government agencies is reviewing how their funding's going. You'll see there was a comment already on the chat about one of the government funds that's being reviewed. These things are really important. What we ask is that you include the sector. You can reach out to peak bodies such as Hauora or Volunteering New Zealand. There's other ones as well, that you bring us in to help work with you to try to find solutions in this space. There's no sort of one size fits all. Michelle, what's your thinking?
Awesome. Thank you, Rochelle. And a very articulate and long question. And I guess it's the $1 million question in many ways. But I will sort of reverse it and say, I guess actually the answer is in some, better, more connected relationships with the community and co-design those to come up with those solutions potentially. Flipping it, when I look at, I think there are some key enablers that might help us get there, because we're not going to get there overnight. But in terms of reducing the competitive cycle to start with, is having longer term cycles of funding to start with, 3 to 5 years, and including funding for stuff that helps you build an organisation towards more collaboration and so I think those two things. And I think as an example, for example, Volunteering New Zealand accesses funds from the Support for Volunteering Fund, which we're very grateful to receive. We've been, in the last 3 years, we've been on our first 3-year cycle, but many years before that was annually. And what that has enabled us to do over the last 3 years is actually focus in on our State of Volunteering report, which typically we would have been doing year to year. We've been looking at it over a 2 to 3 year period, or 2 year period, and that's enabled us to build in relationships more broadly to actually then go out and listen more to voices and include them in the design and the output. So I think, there's a lot of different ways we can get there, but that's a way we could start.
I think there was a lot of trust in the report, a lot of conversation in the report about trusted relationships, so that often community organisations felt that the current application processes put all the onus on them to really prove that they were worthy and trustworthy. But actually the reality is a lot of this information is already online. So people have websites, they've got social media, they've got their reporting back on the charities register, often they've got annual reports, strategic plans, etc., etc. That there was a lot of information already out there to show credibility for organisations. And you'll know yourself, if you just ask around in any given environment, people can say, oh, there's this organisation or this organisation. People will recommend and know of the ones that are doing really amazing mahi in any sort of place-based environment. So they were asking a lot about that. And I would say as a starting point is talk to the people who you fund. Get them in, work on the premise that there's a bit of a power imbalance there, and they might not be able to be completely honest. But also, ask them, like, if you got funding, what is it that you actually need? And start to do more work with them to really understand the ones that you currently fund. What we saw last year was, we know in the beginning of the pandemic that funders reached out directly to the ones they were funding. But from our perspective, there's a whole group of people, I think, or community groups that probably should be being funded, both by government or eligible for grants, that are simply don't have the infrastructure in place to even be able to be funded or to be heard to get to a position where they're able to apply for funding. So there's, really use organisations like us, like the peak bodies, like the connectors, like your local maraes, like your Pacifica churches. They can connect you into any community they know, or can connect you with someone who can connect you. If you're looking to expand and reach in and find out who is funded and who is not funded, and trying to find some fresh ways to find to match some of these community groups that should be eligible for funding but are simply not set up. They don't, they're by majority 1 to 5 staff. Some of them are currently fully voluntary, working in other full-time roles, and just are not currently resourced even to hear about funding, let alone apply. We had a Pacifica whenua with 50 people in it. They had about 15 funding advisors, and obviously the funding advisors had talked initially and they said there was 40 funds, and there's a great comment in there saying 40 funds, how can we possibly know about 40 funds, and try to work out what to actually apply for in that. And then there was other examples of people within the communities, particularly in the Pacifica community, saying we have to help people set up and register as a charity or get in a place where they're able to receive funding, because they simply don't have the resources to do that.
Thank you. Another question here. Is there any info in terms of the sustainability data as to how many of the original survey respondent charities may have folded since 2020? Asking because I think the outlook for financial sustainability looked more positive in 2021. And maybe if you don't have data, you may have some anecdotal knowledge. It is a question that we hear a bit, is are charities closing their doors?
So it's not directly in the data set that I've seen. However, in my discussions with charity services, is that the number of charities deregistering is roughly about the same last year and this year as in normal. So we're not necessarily seeing that in an impact in terms of charities closing. What we have seen is there were some indications in the data about charities stepping into more voluntary roles or letting go staff and reducing down numbers, etc., to enable them to be sustainable and survive through this period of time, but nothing that's directly related to that. I can also see that there's a question around, have we any data on the numbers of organisations who've ceased operation? Yeah, so I think, what we're seeing is, as you know from the sector, and it shows in the research, the sector's incredibly committed. We talked about it as a labour of love. And Volunteering New Zealand talks about mahi araha. So the reality is that people are committed, remain committed to serving the communities that they serve, whether it's paid or unpaid, that they're reaching out within their own communities to try to find the resources that they need, if they don't have them, to be able to enable to go forward. And I think that's why we're practically not seeing more organisations tip over. Michelle, maybe you have some comments.
I would only add to that anecdotally, kind of talking through those whether organisations have closed or folded with the volunteer centres on a regular basis, we haven't seen around the Motu lots of that happening. I think in my own direct experience where we co-share, one organisation has moved into and I guess merged with another, but everyone's still there doing the same stuff, but in one bigger organisation. So similar to what you've been saying, really.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. We have someone on the Zoom who's interested to know if there were some specific areas for support identified in the last survey. It asked about community sector needs, e.g. fundraising, comms and marketing.
Michelle?
Can you ask that again? Sorry.
Did the survey generate any data on specific areas of support? For example,
we did ask that same question, and it pretty much came out looking the same as last year, which is the classic fundraising, grant writing, sharing our story, telling our story, pretty much the same. You know, not a lot has really shifted in organisations other than the service delivery going up. Is that ultimately the structures of how organisations run is roughly the same. They're still needing the same level of support, if not more support than previously. Also, I noticed that, thanks Andrew from Charity Services has said, so he's saying less removals of charities than normal over the last year. And he's recently got data that shows 7 charities have explicitly called out COVID as why they voluntarily removed themselves. So that's quite a small number. I think there's a lot of public kōrero about that, but I'm not sure that's actually the reality. I think people are incredibly committed to the people that they serve, and they essentially are demonstrating they find a way to make that work.
Right. I'm going to squeeze in one more quick question, if that's okay. 39% said they'd seen a serious decrease in funding or in their revenue. Do you know, is that government funding, philanthropic funding, is that, you know, they're less able to earn through events? Have you got any data on the why behind that funding drop?
So we do have data, but we haven't done analysis of it yet. So our plan is from February to June next year, each month we'll be releasing specific topic theme-driven data, which will have a little bit more in-depth analysis in terms of specific reasonings around that. So one of them will be on funding. So we'll make sure to include a little bit more of the in-depth levels underneath that about why people have decreased their funding. We did the same with the data set from last year. In April, we did another level of analysis to try to kind of identify who actually were, who were most at risk and who were the ones that were, you know, what was actually causing them to be stepping away.
Thank you. I would just like to acknowledge Hui and Volunteering New Zealand again. This is a great piece of data. It's also amazing to see the changes from last year, showing the value of repeating the survey, also the insights that you've given around it. And even more importantly, I know both your organisations have been doing work in the past 12 months to try and help the issues that were identified in that first survey. So we look forward to further action. And as you've mentioned, Philanthropy New Zealand's got an initiative as well that looks to progress some of these issues. And as you say, Rochelle and Michelle, they're rather big issues. So thank you very much. And I will hand to you for the wrap up, Rochelle.
Thanks. So, I mean, we incredibly appreciated the time that these community organisations took to complete this data, with, you know, more than 600 community organisations providing their thoughts and lived experience of what it's like for them on the ground, working frontline in our communities during this pandemic. We are incredibly grateful for that. We really thank McCabe Research Aotearoa for the really broad research that they were able to conduct. And we were very happy that we got in just before the lockdown, because we weren't quite sure, but we managed to still get focus groups in before that. And many thanks to Solmaz as well, who's been able to massage the research into what we're releasing. So just a reminder that today we'll send you out a recording of today and a copy of the slides. There's also a reminder that in there is the full report and a summary report as well. So we do encourage you to share amongst your networks. The more people that do that, the better. Also to let you know that we're also releasing the anonymized open data set for people that would like to do their own research. I think there's about 360 organisations on there. Not everybody agreed to share their data, so that's why it's a smaller data set. but you can also take that and apply that and use that data yourself to do your own analysis if you want to look in specific areas. So I really encourage you to do that as well. The more that we can use this data to get it out there, to tell the story of the incredible mahi that's going on in our communities, the amazing tangata whenua community and voluntary organisations that have stepped up, continue to step up, make sure that the well-being of our communities, particularly for those people who may not get picked up or either self-elect out of the government services that are available. Really, we're an essential core part of the economy. We're 12.1 billion. That's 4% of our GDP. We're 150,000 paid employees and 159 million voluntary hours. So we're a really large part of the economy, but we need you to help tell our stories. We need you to partner with us to start to drive these changes. And just again, thank you for those who are really working in this space to really start to try to bring about the needed changes. And kia ora everybody, thank you so much for your time, and thank you Sue and Philanthropy New Zealand for, as always, supporting us. And I'm going to hand you over now to Michelle, who'll finish with the karakia.
Kia ora, thank you, Rochelle. And I would just like to tautoko what Rochelle has just said, and also thank you to everyone who's taken the time to join us today. I know it's such a busy time, so thanks for joining with us, and thank you, Solmaz. You've done an amazing piece of work here for us. So ka pai. To draw us to a close before we go back to the busyness of our day. Kia whakarea te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, haumie, huie, taikea. Kia ora everybody, thank you.